Just outside the sacred town of Pushkar in Rajasthan lies Sudhabai Kund, a centuries old water tank long associated with spiritual healing and local folklore. Each year, during Mangala Chaturthi, families travel from across India, believing its waters can free those thought to be possessed by evil spirits. A young man named Ravi traveled with his older sister Meera to the annual Ghost Fair at Sudabai. For months, Meera had changed. She spoke to people who weren't there. She refused to enter temples. Some nights she laughed for hours. Other nights she woke the entire neighborhood screaming. Doctors found nothing wrong. Eventually, the family did what generations before them had done. They took her to Sudabai. The place was unlike anything Ravi had ever seen. Hundreds of families. There were priests chanting, people crying, some laughing hysterically. Others tied with cloth ropes so they wouldn't run away. The atmosphere was unsettling before anything supernatural even happened. One by one, people stepped into the sacred water. Some left quickly, others collapsed. Some even began vomiting. There were some who screamed. No one seemed to be surprised. It was just simply part of the ritual. Finally, it was Mira's turn. The priest told Ravi, whatever happens, don't touch her until she comes out of the water herself. She stepped into the kund. Nothing. And then she suddenly let out a scream unlike anything Ravi had ever heard. It wasn't loud, it was deep, and it almost sounded male. The water around her rippled violently. She collapsed beneath the surface. For several terrifying seconds, she didn't come back up. Then she rose, completely calm. She smiled at Ravi. For the first time in months, she looked like herself. The priest simply nodded. It's gone. The family returned home relieved. For several weeks, everything seemed normal. Mira laughed again. She slept peacefully, started helping around the house. Ravi began believing the stories were true. And then one night, Ravi woke to the sound of someone walking through the courtyard. He assumed it was Mira. He looked outside. She was standing there, perfectly still, facing away from the house, looking toward the road. Mira? He asked. She didn't answer. He walked closer. Just as he was about to touch her shoulder, she quietly said, "It followed us home." She slowly turned around. Her face was completely normal. She smiled, then said, "It couldn't step inside the sacred grounds of the temple, so it waited outside." Growing up in the Middle East, I often heard stories about the desert. Some were harmless tales told around campfires, others were warnings passed down from one generation to the next. But there was one story I heard more than once. And what always unsettled me wasn't the story itself, it was how many people told it exactly the same way. According to local accounts, this happened decades ago, long before modern highways cut through the desert, and long before mobile phones connected people to the outside world. A truck driver was making a delivery across a remote stretch of road. The journey was long. Hours would pass without another vehicle in sight. On either side of the road, there was nothing but darkness and endless sand. It was close to midnight when he saw her. A woman standing alone at the edge of the road. At first, he assumed her vehicle had broke down. It wasn't impossible. Travel in those days could be unpredictable. He slowed his truck and rolled down the window. Are you all right? He called out. The woman didn't answer. She simply raised her arm and pointed toward the desert. The driver looked into the darkness. There was nothing there. No sign of lights or buildings or people around. He called out again, and still no answer. Only that same silent gesture, pointing into the darkness. The driver felt uneasy. The nearest settlement was many miles away. How had she gotten there? And more importantly, why was she alone? After a few moments, he decided not to stop. He rolled up the window and continued driving. In his mirror, he could still see her standing by the roadside, watching him. Several minutes passed, and eventually he got a little curious. He glanced at the mirror again, but the woman was now gone. Relieved, he turned his attention back to the road. And suddenly, he immediately slammed the brakes. Standing ahead of him, illuminated by the truck's headlights, was the same woman who was now several hundred meters in front of him. The driver stared in disbelief. There was no way she could have gotten there. There was nothing in plain sight, just the long stretch of the open desert. And the woman standing silently in the middle of the road. The driver didn't wait to find out more. He threw the truck in reverse, turned around, and drove back the way he had come. By the time he reached the nearest town, he was visibly shaken. The older men listened carefully as he described what happened. And when he finished, none of them seemed surprised. One of them simply nodded. You just encountered a ghoul. The driver frowned. He had heard the word before, but only in stories. The old man explained that travelers had spoken for generations about strange entities that wandered the desert at night. They appeared in many forms. Sometimes you'll find a lost child, or a wounded traveler, or maybe a woman in distress. But their purpose was always the same: to lure people away from the safety of the road. The old man then asked a question. Did she ever speak to you? The driver shook his head. The old man smiled. Well, then you were lucky. The driver never traveled that route after dark again. And whenever the story was told, the ending remained the same. The older men would stare toward the desert and repeat the same warning. If something is calling you from beyond the road, just keep driving, because some things out there aren't looking for help, they're looking for company. Malaysia has a rich tradition of folklore, much of it tied to spirits, shamans, and beliefs that have been passed down for generations. Among the most feared were stories involving the Pelisit and the Palong. These were said to be spirit familiars, entities that could be captured, controlled, and used to harm others. Whether people believed in them or not, a few were willing to speak their names after dark. This story comes from Selangor in the late 19th century. According to local accounts, a wealthy landowner became convinced that someone was using black magic against him. At first, the incident seemed minor. Some of his workers had fallen ill. Several mentioned having strange dreams. Others refused to work after sunset. The landowner refused to listen to their complaints. Then one of the workers began behaving strangely. She claimed that she could hear insects speaking to her, not the sound of buzzing insects or chirping crickets, but they were human voices. At first, of course, people laughed it off. But her condition continued to worsen. She stopped sleeping, and at night, family members would find her sitting upright in bed, staring silently into empty corners of the room. When she was questioned, she insists she was listening to something nobody else could hear. Eventually, the situation became impossible to ignore. The workers began screaming in the middle of the night. She clawed at her throat and insisted that something was crawling inside her. Terrified, the household summoned a local Bomoh. A Bomoh is a traditional Malay shaman, folk healer, and spiritual mediator. The Bomoh arrived shortly before sunset and spent several hours speaking with the young woman. According to witnesses, she eventually entered a trance like state. And that was when things became even stranger. Her voice changed. Instead of speaking normally, she began answering questions in a high pitched tone that sounded nothing like her own. Again and again, the voice repeated the name of a woman who lived in a neighboring village. The Bomoh listened carefully. When the questioning was finished, he delivered his conclusion. A Pelesit had been sent against her. Now, whether anyone truly believed him is impossible to know. But the story claims the Bomoh immediately ordered the house searched. The floorboards were lifted, walls were inspected, every room was examined. Eventually, beneath a loose floor bed, they reportedly discovered a small seal bottle. When they looked inside, they saw something very strange. It looked like dry blood, as well as several items no one could identify. The Bomoh ordered the bottle removed. Then he began a ritual that continued through the night. The group then prayed and burned incense. And according to those present, the worker's condition slowly improved. By sunrise, she was calm, and within days, she returned to normal. Whether the event was possession, illness, hysteria, suggestion, or something else entirely remains impossible to say. But the story survived. For decades, people continued to repeat it through the region. If you ever discover a sealed bottle hidden where it shouldn't be, don't open it. Some things are easier to imprison than they are to put back. After the pandemic finally began to settle down, I decided it was time to visit my mom. It had been almost a year since I had seen her, and I was looking forward to spending a week back home in the South. It was already getting unbearably hot as summer approached, but I didn't mind. I've never really been a cold weather person anyway. One thing I was particularly excited about was visiting the old market in town. The place had been around for over 100 years. It was the kind of market where you could spend hours wandering around and still discover something new. There were antique shops tucked into narrow lanes, vendors selling old vinyl records and gramophones, and stalls packed with ancient coins whose origins nobody seemed entirely sure about. Before heading there, I had mentioned it to my boyfriend. He's a history enthusiast and loved collecting old coins. So naturally, he asked if I could keep an eye out for anything interesting. I spent quite a bit of time browsing through trays of old coins. Some looked Victorian, others appeared to be from former princely states. A few were so worn down that you could barely make out the markings. Eventually, I bought a small collection for myself and picked up a few extras for him as well. I paid the shopkeeper and was about to leave when something caught my eye. Hanging on the wall behind the counter was a small shield. It was old, extremely old by the look of it. The metal was tarnished and covered in patches of rust. Two crossed swords had been worked into the design, giving it the appearance of something that belonged in a museum rather than a dusty market stall. I couldn't stop staring at it. Now, I'm not an antique collector. I never have been. I just enjoy history. And the moment I saw it, I found myself wondering where it had come from. Had it actually been used in battle? Was it ceremonial? Was it simply decorative? I had no idea, but I knew I wanted it. I asked the shopkeeper if it was for sale. At first, he refused. He claimed that it was far too old and valuable. I told him I was interested anyway. After a fair amount of bargaining, he finally agreed to sell it. And just like that, I walked out of the market carrying a shield I knew nothing about. The rest of my trip was fairly normal. I spent time with family, caught up with old friends, visited familiar places I hadn't seen in years. A week later, I returned home. Naturally, one of the first things I did was show my boyfriend everything I bought. When my boyfriend came over, he was immediately interested in the coins. That wasn't surprising. His father had spent years collecting old currency, and after his passing, the collection had been passed down to him. Over time, he'd become quite knowledgeable about identifying old coins and researching their history. So, we spread everything across the table and started examining what I'd bought. The excitement didn't last very long. One by one, he began setting coins aside. Fake, then another. Also fake, and another. The more he looked, the worse it got. Most of the coins the shopkeeper had claimed were Victorian turned out to be replicas. Some weren't even particularly convincing replicas. I was furious. I'd spent an entire afternoon carefully selecting them, and now it looked like I had been completely scammed. Part of me wanted to go back and confront the seller. The other part of me knew that there wasn't much I could do, realistically. The market was old, crowded, and filled with vendors selling items whose origins were often impossible to verify. Thankfully, not everything turned out to be fake. Among the collection, we found one genuine coin from the reign of Krishna Raja Vadiyar of Mysore. That discovery softened the disappointment a little. At least something from that shopping trip was authentic. Then I showed him the shield. The moment he saw it, he stopped what he was doing. Now, my boyfriend is a Rajput, and growing up, he spent years learning about Rajput history, weapons, and armor. If there was anyone I knew who would give me an educated opinion, it was him. He picked up the shield and turned it over several times, examining the brass, studying the design, running his fingers across the worn metal. Finally, he set it down. Well, it certainly resembles shields used during the 16th and 17th century, he said. I immediately perked up. So it's real? He laughed. I didn't say that. He explained that reproductions weren't uncommon. Without documentation or proper authentication, there was no way to know whether it was genuinely old or simply made to look old. Still, he admitted something about it felt convincing. The ware looked natural, the brass appeared genuinely aged, and if someone had told him it had come from that period, he wouldn't immediately dismiss the possibility. Well, that was good enough for me. Whether it was authentic or not, I thought it looked incredibly cool. A few days later, we hammered a nail into the wall above the doorway leading into my bedroom and hung it there. It immediately became one of the most notable things in the apartment. Whenever people visited, they would ask about it. And every time I walked past it, I found myself glancing up at it. At that point, I didn't think much of it. It was simply an interesting decorative piece, nothing more. A few weeks later, strange things started happening. I work night shifts, which means I log in at 9 p.m. and usually don't finish until 6 in the morning. It's not a schedule I'd recommend to anyone, but jobs are hard to come by. My desk sits near the balcony and faces the wall while I work. The television is mounted on the adjacent wall. And every time I stepped away from my desk and walked towards my bedroom, I passed beneath the old shield hanging above the doorway. That's when the noises began. There was this one night where I didn't have any calls, so I was trying to finish a work order. I was completely focused on what I was doing when suddenly I heard a scraping sound somewhere behind me. I stopped typing and turned around. Nothing. I couldn't see anything out of place. Now, I live alone and I'm pretty used to hearing random noises at night. The building makes sounds, things settle. Sometimes the vessels in the kitchen shift around slightly. It honestly doesn't bother me. So I just ignored it and went back to work. A couple of nights later, I heard it again. This time, I checked the clock. 3:15 a.m. For some reason, that stuck with me. I remember wondering if it was the same time I heard it before, but I couldn't be sure. Again, I tried to come up with a reasonable explanation. Something in the kitchen had shifted. Maybe I was just tired. Night shifts do strange things to your sleep schedule. A few nights after that, something happened that bothered me a lot more than the scraping sounds. I was sitting at my desk working when I suddenly became aware of something beside me. Just that weird feeling you get when you become convinced somebody is standing there. I did not turn, I just froze, sitting at my desk. My hands stiffened. I remember staring at my monitor and trying to convince myself I was being ridiculous. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move near my shoulder, a dark shape moving from left to right. It crossed my peripheral vision and then disappeared, just like that. I sat there for a few seconds, wondering whether I'd actually seen it. Then I got up and checked the entire apartment, my room, the balcony, the bathroom, everything. The front door was still dead bolted. Nothing was missing or out of place. I eventually went back to my desk, said a few mantras under my breath, and tried to forget about it. The rest of the night was completely uneventful, but one thing kept nagging at me. Every strange thing I'd noticed seemed to happen around 3:15 in the morning, and I couldn't stop thinking about that. The next day was a Saturday. I slept in, woke up sometime in the afternoon, and spent most of the day doing absolutely nothing. After working nights all week, that's usually my preferred weekend activity. At some point, I got a text message from an old friend. And when I say old friend, I mean old friend. I hadn't heard from her in 16 years. Her name was Camilla. She told me she was in town and asked if I wanted to catch up. I suggested lunch or dinner. She said she had already had plans, but asked if she could stop by later with a couple of beers. And honestly, that sounded even better. I enjoy meeting people at home, it's more relaxed. So I told her to come over. She arrived around 9 that evening. The moment I opened the door, it felt like stepping back into school. We used to be a part of the same group of friends. I was always the odd one out. Most of the girls were popular. They were involved in every club, every activity at the school. I was meanwhile interested in art, singing, and generally kept to myself. But despite our differences, they always included me. And I genuinely appreciated that. So when Camilla showed up, I was happy to see her. We started talking, then talking some more. One beer became two, 1 hour became three. Before we knew it, we were sitting in my apartment, reminiscing about school, teachers, embarrassing moments, and all the stupid things we thought were important back then. At one point, she laughed at me and said, "Those were good times, weren't they?" I smiled. They really were. Then I added, "Although I think I'd rather be the person that I am now than the person I was back then." She looked at me. "Really?" "Definitely," I laughed. I was painfully shy. You guys were all so confident. I was just happy you let me hang around. Camilla didn't laugh. Instead, she stared into her beer for a few seconds. Then she looked back at me. "Oh, but your life turned out really well, eventually, huh? You've got a great job, a boyfriend who loves you, and you still have great hair." I laughed. "Camilla, I work nights. There's nothing special about my job. I can almost guarantee you that nobody is happy with their job." She raised an eyebrow. "I would kill to be in your position." The way she said it caught me completely off guard. Then she continued, "You know, I got laid off at work about 6 months ago. I've been staying with friends and trying to get my parents to help me out, but of course they won't." She took another sip of the beer. "They abandon me like they always do because I'm not the firstborn. My brother means everything to them." She laughed bitterly. "Their precious little son." At this point, something about her demeanor changed. I don't know how else to explain it. Her eyes seemed wider. There was something about her that seemed almost dark. It was as though years of resentment were suddenly pouring out all at once. "You know what's funny?" she said. "You were always the one who didn't have much. Guys never looked at you. Most people barely noticed you." I stared at her. The comment was so unexpected that I wasn't even sure how to respond. "But look at you now," she continued. "So pretty. You got your cute apartment and all this stuff hanging on your walls." I shifted uncomfortably. "Camilla, I think you need to calm down." "What did you think was going to happen if I came over?" She leaned forward. "Do you think we'd sit here reminiscing about the good old days and pretend everything is okay?" Her voice was rising now. "Because it's not okay." The room felt noticeably smaller, not because of anything supernatural, simply because I no longer recognized the person sitting across from me. "You're living the kind of life I wanted," she said. "It's almost like you stole it from me." I shook my head. "Camilla, that's ridiculous." But she wasn't listening anymore. "You and your constant posting, the places you go, your perfect boyfriend, your perfect life." And that's when I realized this wasn't really about me. I was just the person sitting in front of her when years of anger finally boiled over. At this point, I was genuinely uncomfortable. A part of me wanted to leave my own apartment and check into a hotel for the night. The other part of me wondered what would happen if I left Camilla here by herself. I was pretty sure she would trash the place. We were both standing now. The conversation had completely spiraled out of control. Before I could say anything else, Camilla lunged at me and hit me with such force. It caught me completely off guard. I stumbled backward and hit the wall. Instinctively, I raised my arm to protect myself. Looking back, I still don't know why I didn't fight back. I was lying down like a helpless little puppy, taking the punches and kicks. I couldn't process what was happening. Maybe part of me was still trying to reconcile the person attacking me with the friend I remembered from school. And then, out of nowhere, something happened that to this day I can't explain. The shield hanging above the bedroom door suddenly came crashing down to the marble floor, causing such a loud sound that it could have been heard at least 2 miles away. It even made a ripple effect against the ground that lasted for what seemed like 5 minutes. The sound was deafening. I remember clamping my hands over my ears to make sure they don't pop. The sound seemed to echo through the apartment far longer than it should have. Camilla, startled by the whole thing, screamed. She took one look at the shield on the ground, turned around, and bolted for the front door. Within seconds, she was gone. I just lay there on the floor, trying to figure out what had happened. The apartment was silent again. The shield was lying a few feet away from me, and I had absolutely no idea what to make of any of it. I instinctively looked up at the clock, and there it was, clear as day. The time was 2 minutes past 3:15. I never heard from Camilla again after that. She just disappeared. A few weeks later, I contacted a couple of our friends to see if they have heard from her. And that's when I learned the rest of the story. Apparently, her husband had left her for a younger woman. The marriage had been falling apart for quite some time. There had been constant arguments and accusations, a lot of anger. Camilla had married my ex boyfriend. That was news to me, but I wasn't bothered. My relationship with him hadn't lasted very long, and I was never particularly serious about it. He reached out to me once, but I left him on red and didn't bother looking him up. But according to our friends, he wasn't over our relationship. They claimed he had kept old photographs of me hidden away in his closet. When Camilla found them, it became a source of countless arguments. She was convinced that he still had feelings for me. Whether that was true or not, I have no idea. What I do know is that none of this came up when she visited. She never mentioned about her marriage. She never mentioned about the photographs. She never mentioned my ex. Instead, she carried all that resentment with her for years. And eventually it exploded. Maybe a bit of both. But I know one thing: life is difficult for everyone. I decided that I had everything I needed in my life, and I had a good support system. All of us go through our share of problems. No one's life is smooth sailing. Not unless you're maybe a millionaire. But after that night, after the shield falling and the warnings, some part of me felt a little grateful for it. And maybe that makes me sound a little superstitious. But the shield felt like it symbolized something, a history of protection and preservation. I hung the shield back on the wall and made a promise to myself. Next time, I will be prepared. Hi everyone, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed tonight's stories, I'd love for you to subscribe. New episodes of Story Lantern are released every week, each featuring original horror stories inspired by folklore, myths, and legends of Asia. If you have a favorite story from your own country or culture, let me know in the comments below, or you can reach out to me on asian.myth.horror at gmail.com. I may feature it in an upcoming episode. Until next time. And if you ever feel someone watching you from the shadows, keep your lantern lit.